بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode of Sunday the Community with me, Hafiz Muhammad Umar. And in today's show, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Baroness Grey-Thompson. Welcome to the show, Baroness Grey-Thompson.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And for those of you that have been tuning in over the last year or so, you will know that this week is our first celebration of our first birthday of Sending the Community here on Spy 105.1 FM. And we are delighted with the number of shows we have done so far over the last year. And one of the things that we are very keen on is looking at ability of people with disabilities and the achievements. And we've covered disability sport in the past, art, music, drama, etc. And I'm very passionate about disability. I think most of you will know that I run the Disability Cricket Club here at Luton Town Indians Cricket Club in Luton, and also, disability sport in general, from football at Luton Town Football Club to tag rugby to zone hockey and riding for the disabled. And also the Paralympics we touched based on last year through Wheel Power over at Stoke Mandeville, when I was able to visit their amazing sports facilities. And Baroness Grey-Thompson is no stranger to these amazing sports. And I will let Baroness Grey-Thompson tell us a bit about herself and introduce herself. Over to you, Baroness Grey-Thompson.
Oh, thank you. And that's really sweet. Call me Tanny, please, because my title's quite long. Thank you. Thank you. I was born and brought up in Cardiff, and I've got spina bifida, so I could walk a little bit when I was young, but then I became paralysed when I was about 5 or 6. I can't really remember when it was. But basically, I'm missing vertebra at the back of my spinal cord, and it's exposed. And what happened as I grew, my spine collapsed and my vertebra severed my spinal cord. So there wasn't any pain, I didn't miss any school. But I had to start using a wheelchair. And I think what shocked my parents was there was lots of people who suddenly started telling them about all the things I would never do in my life because I was a wheelchair user. And to them, I was just Tanny. I hadn't changed. I just stopped walking. So it was kind of interesting how people sort of treated me and my parents. But I was really lucky I went to mainstream school, because at the time, special school education for disabled children was just appalling. I mean, they didn't educate the kids at all. I watched the London Marathon on TV when I was 12. And really, that was the turning point for me. I was like, yeah, I want to do that. I'm going to do the London Marathon one day. And that really had just a big impact on my career and wanted to do sport. So I competed at 5 Paralympic Games, won 16 medals. And now, when I retired,
that's the normal thing.
So now I work in politics. So I sit in the House of Lords and I campaign all around disability rights.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for summing that introduction so beautifully. And if you go back to early life, if you may please. So that transition from being able to walk and realizing you won't be able to walk, do you have a memory of that yourself at all, or is this something that you just hear from your parents or the wider family?
So I don't remember really walking. I remember not being able to do things. So I couldn't walk very far and I used to fall over. So for me, when I had my first chair, it was suddenly I could do lots of stuff. And so for me, having a chair was like quite exciting because I could do things. But yeah, people were quite down on me and my parents. My parents were told I'd never get an education, I'd never get a job, I'd live at home forever. No one would ever marry me. And it was all sort of a bit horrible, actually. But where I was lucky was my parents were like, well, that's just, nonsense. So I've got an older sister, and it was very much about not bringing me up any differently to my older sister. and were expected to study and work hard and, do stuff. And, so I think that helped. So my parents didn't really wrap me in cotton wool, which a lot of, I think, parents of disabled children, for the right reasons, but became overprotective. And I remember I was about 10, nearly 11, and I had the chance to go on a riding for the disabled holiday, like a week away. I mean, only about half an hour from where I lived, so not very far away. And because I used to do riding for the disabled. And there was another young woman who had the chance to do it. So bearing in mind, I was 11, 10, 11. This other mum said to my mum, "Oh, we're not going to let her go because she's going to miss a bedtime story." And I remember my mum coming over to me and saying, "Right, you're going." Because he said the girl was like 23. And, there was no need for her to still be having a bedtime story at 23. They just sort of kept her as a child. And I remember my mum saying, "Right, you're off. Like, if you think I'm going to be reading a bedtime story to you when you're 23, you're having a laugh." So it is sort of quite funny. So there were lots of different points that had an impact on me and my life. And my parents were both, my mum watched a lot of sport. My dad played a lot of sport. And that was kind of, being active was really important to them. So they very much encouraged me to be active and to think about. And again, at that point, it wasn't about Paralympic pathway. It was about just being fit enough to push my chair around. The world wasn't terribly accessible. There were no drop curbs. There were not many accessible toilets around. So it was very much about me being able to push myself and not be reliant on other people. And then just gradually over time, that sort of transferred into me doing sport and being quite sporty. And, I was also lucky I had the opportunity to play lots of different sports.
What sort of sports did you start playing in your childhood?
Oh, loads. I mean, so growing up in Cardiff was a lot of luck, really, because there was it's not a big city, but there's a lot of sports opportunities. So, the office that I'm sitting in at the moment, so I chair Sport Wales. We have a big leisure centre, and I actually learned to swim in the building that I'm sitting in now. And I did riding and played tennis, and I was really lucky. I went to a state high school, and we had a swimming pool, which is like really unusual. So, we got access to swimming lessons like every week in high school. I was completely rubbish at swimming, like just awful. But I just had lots of opportunities to be active. And where we lived, was pretty accessible as well. So it was where we lived was quite flat, and there were level access shops and things. So all those things made a real difference. So my world around me was relatively accessible. So it's only then when I started traveling that you start realizing that actually a lot of places are really inaccessible. So, there was just a lot of luck where I grew up, really.
Mm. And I guess from a leisurely perspective, I've been quite lucky. I've been to Cardiff a couple of times, and Cardiff Castle appears to be quite flat, at least at ground level anyway.
Yeah.
But somewhere like Edinburgh Castle, for example, where you go all the steps and, huge steep hill to get up before you get even near the base of the castle.
The city centre is really accessible. It's flat. So I couldn't have picked a better place to grow up, really.
Very lucky for you. And I guess in Luton, in many ways, we are quite lucky for what we have available locally. And in terms of the sports, as I mentioned, the main popular sports, there is accessibility and opportunities available. Cricket, we started here about 11, 12 years ago, and disability cricket. It was through disability cricket that we went to a tournament in Cardiff a few years ago. We were able to enjoy the facilities there at the county ground in Cardiff, which is also a test venue. And then just explore around and to see more of the city. And what we wanted to do in Luton was have this vision that disability is something that shouldn't hinder the opportunities for young people, and see what we could do to create that. And at Luton Town Indians Cricket Club, we were quite lucky. 2012 going to 2013 was the season we started disability cricket. And since
Mm.
then, we played, as I mentioned, at Cardiff, Lords, Headingley, Old Trafford, over the borders in Scotland into Perth and Kinross, etc. Colvin Bay, North Wales. So we travelled far and wide. And I guess from our perspective, we've been quite lucky in that we've been able to secure our own private transport. So going on a school minibus, which we were able to hire from here, and we were able to go all the way. On one occasion, though, we did on public transport, so that was flying from Luton to Aberdeen, and then from Aberdeen we caught the train down to Perth, and then we repeated the journey on the way back. That wasn't too difficult. Then, if we were to do the journey from Luton train station on a train, even some 12, 13 years later, that still would have been quite a different story altogether. And I know you touched base earlier about how you were able to access pretty much everything locally. When you started to travel around, what was the experience for you like accessing public transport as you're growing up and working towards becoming a professional athlete?
Yeah, so where I grew up, buses were not accessible at all. Not only did they have a big step, but then they had a pole that you couldn't get your wheelchair through. Trains were not accessible, but at least some train stations had ramps. And you used to have to sit in the guard's van, which was like freezing and usually quite cold because they didn't take any seats out. So now at least trains are still not accessible, but you don't have to travel in the guards van anymore. So public transport was really difficult. And so, I was dead lucky that my mum could drive and she drove me around. Then, I learned to drive as soon as I could because there weren't any other options. But, now I live in the northeast of England, but I work in London and Cardiff. So I have to use the trains because I just can't I can't do my job and drive, the amount that I need to drive. So I don't enjoy using trains, but I use them because there's no other way to do my job. And I do think, disabled people should be, as much as possible, working, paying taxes, contributing to society. But, the fact that, public transport is not as good as it needs to be, that is another challenge for me. So, I spend a lot of time on social media talking about public transport, and my work in Parliament, a lot of that is around making public transport more accessible, because at the moment it's too hard for a lot of people to try and be able to use it.
Mm. And so, in terms of the current work around access to public transport, I know a lot has been promised by recent governments. For our Luton train station, for example, we lack a lift there at Luton Central, and there is, a lot of promises to try and get that sorted. But nationally speaking, is there still a commitment by the current serving government to make Britain more accessible on public transport for people with disabilities?
Yes, but it's so slow. So the Disability Discrimination Act back in the mid-90s said that all trainers should be step-free by January the 1st, 2020.
Wow.
Basically, every single government's kicked the can down the road and ignored that. And now the previous government said it's going to be 100 years before trains are accessible. And the government could make some really easy changes, like that. They could just, when, they're putting out procurement contracts for trains, they could just say, you have to buy level boarding trains. And they don't do that. And so the government could do more than they're currently doing. So, companies who, the life of a train carriage can be 50 years. So if they're still allowed to buy inaccessible carriages, those will be somewhere in the network for the next 50 years. Um, so there are some sort of shining moments, you know. So Merseyrail have got their closed city loop level boarding. I was there the other week. I could just get on and off on my own. I didn't need to find somebody. I didn't need to worry whether I was going to get off or not. I could just get on and off. It was amazing. Greater Anglia have bought low floor trains. Now, not all of their stations are now step free, but a lot of them are. So they could do a lot more than they're currently doing. And again, it comes back to, if we want disabled people in work, not everyone can drive, not everyone can afford to drive. We need to make public transport better now. So buses are better, taxis are a bit better, but trains are a really important part of that. And it's just too slow. It's way too slow from, you know, how long, you know, we should be waiting for change. It's not fair on a lot of people that it's so inaccessible.
Mm. And I mean, just to contextualize this, again, I'll use sport because, you know, I'm an amateur sports person. You are a professional. And even at grassroots level, when we play our organized sports, at times people do use public transport. I'll go back a couple of seasons when I was playing cricket in Harpen, and we had one of our players coming from Holt White's Trinibus down in London. He used to hop onto the train, carry his kit bag with him, get to happen and come out. It was straightforward. Um, for someone like you, as a professional athlete, trying to get to where you needed to be with all the equipment, has that always been a singing or dancing as the government would like us to believe? Or have you had any challenges? Are there any particular kind of stories you could share with us? Um,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, sports equipment for disabled people is really expensive. So, you know, if you can buy a bike if you're not disabled, you know, relatively cheap bike to get you started if you want to ride. You know, you can spend £100 on a bike and it'll get you going. In for disability sport, a basic racing chair can be a couple of £1,000s. And a lot of families just haven't got that kind of money, you know, and it's so getting involved, getting started, you know, can be quite difficult. And, you know, there's been lots of research that shows that, you know, disabled children aren't getting access to PE in schools, and, you know, they're still being sent to the library and excluded. And then if you've got that, and then you've got the cost of the equipment. So, you know, I was lucky I had support from a local charity when I first started. And then when I became, you know, better as an athlete, I got some sponsorship, which really helped. But actually, just starting in sport is really difficult for anybody. And also, you know, if you're a parent of a disabled child, you're trying to fight the education system, you're trying to fight healthcare, you know, accessible housing, transport. When you're kind of fighting all those things, being physically active is not probably, can't be top of the list when you're just trying to fight for so many other things. So physical activity gets forgotten. And I think it's a shame, because the London 2012 Paralympics were amazing, absolutely incredible. I worked on them and they were just brittle. But it hasn't really changed people's opportunity to be sporty and to play sport because of all these other things. So one of my frustrations is when people say to me, 2012 changed the world for disabled people. Well, it changed the world for some Paralympians, but it didn't, you know, you know, made Dave Weir, Sarah Story, Ellie Simmons a household name, but it didn't change much disability rights. And you can't, because you don't expect the Olympics to change everything. So it's quite hard to expect the Paralympics to change, you know, everything. But I think we've got to stop talking about, you know, the 2012 games were a long time ago. And it's almost like some people use it as a reason not to do anything else. And I think that's a shame, because we've still got a lot of disabled people who need to be fit and healthy and active and doing stuff.
I think a lot will perhaps also don't realise are the added challenges, even though if you have an accessible opportunities to get from, say, one platform to where you need to be. There might not also be the similar kind of arrangements at your destination, and the way people have needed support to come on and off either the bus or the train or even a taxi. Um, when it works, it's great. When it doesn't, I think that poses unforeseen challenges for them. And I know of one or two stories where people got to the destination they needed to be, there wasn't um, an opportunity for them to be taken off as they had arranged, and their journey ended up being extended, or in some cases, they were actually made to come off the wheelchair and try and come off the train the best they could as independently. You're having other passengers just supporting them. And I think they're the kind of perhaps a situation that people don't quite realize that in a real life situation, it is very, very different to what a person might plan.
And you know, you're saying about, you know, Luton not being step free, and you know, our train stations are really old. I mean, they weren't really designed for women, let alone disabled people. You know, I mean, I sort of joke about the tube. You know, the tube's over 150 years old. You know, so you can't expect it to be perfect. But when they're redesigning, when they're updating, they should put in access. And, you know, because it's not just for wheelchair users, visually impaired people, people with dementia, older people, parents and kids, you know, it just works for everybody. And I think that there is a support program called Access for All, but it's a tiny amount of money in the whole scheme of things. And that there should be a rolling program of making stations more accessible, because, you know, I'm not sure how many people use Luton Station every week, but it's quite a lot, you know, and a lot of those people would really welcome better access, you know. So it's really important that it's. I'm not just arguing about it being for disabled people. It kind of step-free access works for everybody. And I was at a train station the other week. I spend a lot of time at train stations, and the step to get onto the train was massive. And there was a lady. She was probably in her 60s, and she wasn't very tall, and she could barely get up the step because she didn't have very long legs. And it was really sweet because this sort of, you know, teenager came over, and young people get a bit of a bad press. And he kind of came over and he sort of went to push past her. And actually he wasn't pushing past her. He was getting on the train, and then he grabbed her arms to help pull her up onto the train. So I was like, oh, but you know, so it's those situations that, you know, the stuff would just be better for everybody if we think more about access.
Absolutely. And I think for individuals who are then, you mentioned, you know, traveling for work purposes, there is a big drive at the moment as we speak by the current government wanting to cut back on the welfare system, encouraging people with disabilities to get into employment. And we know most of the disabled community are incredibly hardworking. They want to be able to do the very best they can. And I guess what we have continuously campaigned for in my role as a Senko in a school, in yours as a, you know, professional athlete and a parliamentary member, to ensure that those opportunities are turned into a real life opportunities rather than tick box exercise on paper. And together we will continue to campaign to ensure those opportunities come about. We are coming towards the end of the first half of the show. We've got another couple of minutes. And listeners, if you just tuned in, you're listening to Send in the Community with me, Hafiz Muhammad Umar, here in Inspire 105.1 FM. And today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Baroness Tani and Grey-Thompson, who is a professional athlete, disability rights campaigner, and also a member of the House of Lords. She has very kindly taken the time of an incredibly busy schedule to join me, and we are incredibly indebted to you Tani, for taking this time to be with us. And we have another couple of minutes before we go to a short break. And when we come back, we will be talking a bit more about Tani as an individual, Tani as a professional sports person in the making, and Tani then going on to win these amazing medals from around the world. So do stay tuned. And just before we end this first half of the show, we've been talking about accessibility to public transport in particular. And I know we very briefly touched based on other areas like housing and access to the social welfare. We will try and include a bit more of that in the second half of the show. But for now, we will go off to a short break. Tani, it's been wonderful having you with us, and we will continue straight after the break. And so please come back in very, very shortly. Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah, amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the second half of Sending the Community with me, Hafiz Muhammad Umar, here in Inspire 105.1 FM. And if you were with us during the first half of the show, you will know that today we have somebody very exciting and amazing and joining me for the show. And she is no stranger to the world of disability and rights for those with disabilities around the country. She is Baroness Grey-Thompson. Welcome back, Tani.
Thank you.
And it's amazing having you with us. So I will briefly recap what Tani and I have been talking about during the first half of the show. But if you had missed it, please go back on our social media and replay the show. Tani is a professional athlete, and we were talking predominantly about access to public transport during the first half of the show. So if that is something that you had a positive experience or not so positive, please feel free to share your feedback with us. And I'm sure if you need to bring about a bigger change, we can always pass over to Tani to see what can be done in terms of thinking ahead. And we have already touched on accessibility issues at Luton train station. So if that is a hot topic on your heads, please rest assured we'll discuss that during the first half of the show. Tani, we talked a bit about your early life beforehand, and tell us about when you perhaps first thought, hey, despite my disability, there might be a chance of me becoming a professional athlete. Was that primary school, secondary school? When did you start getting those early life vibes?
It was actually kind of a lot later than that, because I knew I wanted to be an athlete and be involved in sport. But when I started, there wasn't a huge amount of media coverage, and there wasn't a lot of financial support. So I went to Loughborough University because that's where Sebco had gone. He was a pretty good runner, and did a politics degree, but always said I'd never work in politics. But then look where I've ended up. And it was probably only when I graduated that I realised that I had a chance of doing it like as a career. So I would have been like 21, 22, but when I had the chance to do that. So luckily now, it's a bit better for some of the younger athletes coming through. But I knew from about the age of 12, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do wheelchair racing, not any other sport. It was only wheelchair racing. And so, yeah, I was lucky that I had the chance to do that.
And so in terms of wheelchair racing, how popular was wheelchair racing? Were you able to compete against other wheelchair racers locally? Did you have to go out of your area?
So I was lucky because of being in Cardiff. Then there was quite a lot going on locally, and then just as you got better, then you started to have to travel a little bit more. But the school I went to was a mainstream comprehensive, and there was a special school next door where there were a lot of wheelchair users. So there was a chance to go and do things next door as well. So it was just very lucky that it was all sort of close around. I mean, there weren't that many special schools in Wales, so that's where all the children went. So because it wasn't too far from where I lived, if you'd lived in West Wales or Mid Wales, it would have been much harder to compete and to take part. But said it was just lucky where I was, and And also, what you do at 12 is very different from what you do at 15, 16, 18, 20. So you just gradually ramp it. At sort of 14, I was training a couple of times a week. By the time I went to university, I was training every day. And then by the time I graduated, I was training 15 times a week. So, it just gradually, and then when I was a full-time athlete, we were training 12 to 15 times a week, 50 weeks of the year. So it's, you don't suddenly start doing that at 12. You do that gradually. And, I had a great time. I got to travel the world and go to some really cool places and compete, So I did Seoul, Barcelona, Atlanta, Sydney, Athens. And then I've worked on each game since. And I'm going to actually, this is never very good for a radio interview, but I'm going to show you a picture behind me, which is on my desk. So this is, I don't know if you can see it. This is a picture of us winning the Olympic and Paralympic bids back in Singapore in 2005. And I've got that behind me on my desk where I work, because it's just a really lovely reminder, because I knew we'd never get a games on home soil in my competitive career. So, getting it within my life was quite a lot of fun to do. And just to remember, sport is really powerful and it can do a lot of really, really good things. And yeah, I have that picture because it just reminds, because the reason I have it is everyone told us we weren't going to win. It was Paris's turn and there was no point bothering bidding, and there was no point, and then people thought we might, and then we did win it. And so whenever I'm having a really tough day, or I'm just thinking, oh, there's so much going on, it's quite hard, I kind of look at that and I find it quite inspirational, because it just shows you've got to keep trying, you got to keep working, and maybe some things won't change, but maybe they will.
Absolutely. So you mentioned how your routine kind of would have changed from training once or twice a week to up to 15 times a week. How did that impact your social, emotional, mental health and well-being? That massive transition. Now I'm a professional athlete, and aspire to become this. I am one now, and now what?
Yeah, I mean, it never really mattered how good I was. You always think, well, my dad used, there's a saying, you're only as good as the last thing you did. Well, my dad used to say, you're only good as your next race, so you've got to be quite forward looking, and you have lots of ups and downs. I lost quite a lot of races. And, because you don't win everything. What people might remember is that I won some big ones, but there's lots that I didn't win. So sport helps you deal with that, the mental health and well-being side of it. I know definitely, when I'm fit and strong and when I'm able to be physically active, I feel better and I work better. And, I think we've got a job to do to get lots of young people being active. Now, the elite stuff sort of looks after itself, but if young people don't have the opportunity to be fit and healthy and active, then that's a problem. And, we know in the UK, like 80% of women are not fit enough to be healthy. And people don't tend to think about their physical fitness until they get ill. And it's like, you need to be thinking about it before you get ill, because we know that if you've got cancer or leukemia, the fitter you are going into treatment, the better you're able to cope with it, and the mental health side. So a lot of the work I do now is around that physical activity, about getting people to think differently about what they do. And I think that's really important. And it's really important for disabled people to be fit and healthy and active.
Absolutely. So at the age of 21, you started working towards becoming a professional. And what was your first big race, either locally, nationally, internationally? You know, actually, I've done really well here. I'm really proud of myself. That very first, moment of joy.
My last race as a junior athlete, which was the national games, I was 16. I won the national title. And up until that point, no one thought I was any good, because I didn't win anything. I might have been second or fifth or sixth, but winning that race then was like, okay. So I knew I was getting better because I could see my times and my coach and everything. But a lot of people within the system didn't. I was a bit of a skinny kid and they just sort of, oh, whatever. And then that sort of made me think, oh, hang on a minute. What if I do more? What if I train harder and better? And then I competed for GB for the first time when I was 17.
Wow, yes.
It wasn't
Is that
great.
what home sale?
Um,
Or did you travel abroad for that?
no, it's at Stoke Mandeville.
You were still Mandeville. Oh,
Stoke
really?
Mandeville.
No,
They
I'm
had a
back at
big
the sir.
they had a big international race there. And then I was 19 when I did my first big race abroad. And I went to Dallas for the
Uh,
US University Championships. And I I I made some big personal best jumps. And so although I didn't win anything, I got a lot quicker. So sometimes you win and sometimes you get faster. And what you try and do is you win and get faster at the same time. So there's a lot that goes into it. But I remember coming back from Dallas thinking, wow, that was amazing. That was, absolutely incredible. And I got to meet a lot of athletes from around the world. And I met Swiss athlete called Daniela Jutzler that she became one of my best friends. Sadly, she's not around anymore. Um, and I just got to meet lots of different athletes, and it's very collaborative and very open and welcoming. And it was quite cool actually. And so there were lots of steps on my road to go into Seoul, which was my first Paralympics where I won a bronze. And then I remember coming back from there and thinking, right, okay, this is what I've done to get to here. Right, I've got 4 years. And you go, well, I haven't got 4 years because of selection. I've got 3.5. And then if you take a day off a week, and then you actually can work out really quickly how many days of training you've got. And then you suddenly like, oh, wow, right, that's not as many. And you got, build in some good bits and bad bits. So I like planning. I do like Excel spreadsheets and things. And so I kind of figured, right, I've got 3.5 years to get really good. But, and I'm very target and focus driven. So for me, it was, coming back from Seoul was, okay, that was make or break for me. It was an amazing experience, but it's like, right, now I've got to sort myself out. And so I went to Barcelona, and I won 4 gold, a silver, and broke 2 world records.
wonderful. That's
It
always
was really
well.
cool.
Just
Yeah.
broke 2 world records, and you're so modest about it.
Well,
So
it was
that
really funny. So
amazing.
my mum hated watching me compete, so she used to get really nervous. So my dad and my sister came to Barcelona. My mum stayed at home, and I remember one of my races was shown live on TV, which is a really big deal as an athlete. It was like that. And I
Yes.
remember finding a payphone, no mobiles then, to ring my mum. And my mum was like, I saw your race. I'm like, yeah. She went, well, yeah. It's like, Mum, I broke the world record. But, well, it doesn't matter about that. I went, what? And as I'd gone into the track, I'd taken the mouthful of water and spat it out. And just on the edge, not on the track, but on the edge of the track. And they'd shown that on TV as well. And my mum went mad with me. She was like, I can't believe you spat on TV. I was like, I didn't spit. I mean, I sort of rinsed my mouth out rather than spit, I wasn't spitting. And I'm justifying it here. And, I didn't spit in front of the camera. I just took a mouth. And she never forgave me for that. It was really funny. Like any time she could bring it up afterwards, but like, do you remember that time you spat on TV? And in the end, you go, yeah, sorry, Mum, sorry. 20 years later, I was still apologizing for it.
No wonder thought they won the World Cup. The World
Doesn't matter.
Cup.
No,
Honestly,
doesn't matter.
I think my
Doesn't
parents
matter.
was like, seriously, I think it was that generation probably where they were
Yeah,
incredibly firm, but if you asked them at the same time, whatever that
yeah,
meant. Yeah. But
yeah.
I think
That was my mum.
uh, wonderful. So was the first Paralympics, and then Barcelona.
Yep.
Yeah,
But,
and then you
but
progress from Spain to Barcelona. So you got a bonus, if I remember correctly. And then when you went to Barcelona, you ended up breaking the world record twice.
yeah,
And then from there, you're now suddenly regular member of Team GB, and
yeah.
you're looking greater, bigger, better things, planning for Athens. Was that next?
Atlanta was next,
Atlanta, right?
and
Okay.
like 96. And so there I won a gold and 3 silvers and broke a world record.
Fantastic.
Um,
So to tell us about the hard work behind the scenes. So you gone from strength to strength, and each time you're coming back, how was your daily routine being impacted? Were you working twice as hard? Were you, what were you doing?
no, I mean, you. it's a balance for training in terms of you've got to train hard, but you don't want to train so hard that you break yourself. So for me, it's not just about the training, which is important, but it's about how you look after yourself. It's about how you sleep, you eat. You know, you've got to drink lots of water. You've got to look after yourself. You've got to stop yourself getting injured. And the thing is, when you're really young, you can train really, really hard and you don't break. But then as you get older, it becomes easier to break yourself. So, it was how we spent time designing the chairs and, what you wear. And, I've never had long hair, but, hair weighs. So you spend all this time, trying really hard to be a certain race weight. And then, it's about everything that you do around it. So training's the absolute given, but if you don't sleep right, if you don't recover, if you don't go to the physio, or massage, if you don't look after yourself, then you won't. And there's no guarantee, even if you do all that, you'll be good. So it's kind of beyond full time, in that, when I got married, we picked the wedding date to fit in around my competition schedule. We did that when I had my daughter. So, there's lots of things that and my family were amazing at supporting me through that as well, because I missed lots of family events because I was away or I was training or, I couldn't do stuff because I was being an athlete.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And so, what about traveling to these Paralympics? Was that easier than traveling for work and leisure purposes around the UK, would you say?
It wasn't too bad because when you're traveling with the team, they're pretty good at looking after you. I mean, the downside is it sounds awful. I can remember coming back from Sydney, which was 2000, and there was about 250 of us on the plane, all in GB kit.
Yes.
And you've each got 2 kit bags. So there's like 500 identical kit bags on the baggage belt at the airport. And it was like, and so what I'd done, we joke, because I've been on, done this quite a lot of times. I bought a load of purple ribbon, and for the whole wheelchair racing squad, I tied purple ribbon around the handles so that we could spot. So you're not having to look every time a bag comes around, look at the name on it, because you'd get a bag and you'd be shouting like, tennis or. So the idea was you could just. So I remember one of the team managers not being very happy with me because he was like, "Well, why did you do that?" I was like, "So we can spot a bag." So we're super organized. I'm super organized about some stuff. So so there's it can be really good fun traveling with the team, but also it can also be really hard because you're there, trying to kind of do everything.
And the Paralympics, there's an Olympics village. Would you have then used the same village for Paralympics straight afterwards, or was that different?
Yeah. So a lot of the time the village was the same, and the village is amazing because, there's 6,000 athletes there. The dining hall sits like 2,000 people, and the food is incredible. So they have everything that you could ever imagine in the dining hall. So, they have vegetarian, vegan, halal, kosher, you name it, they have it. It's just unbelievable. And then there's, Japanese, Chinese, it's like they will have food from all around the world. And there was one funny story where it was a Chinese athlete, and they were going around and it was all like buffet style, and he was sort of putting lots of different things on his plate, and he'd had some meat and he had some pasta and he had some vegetables and he had some salad, and then also there's always like fruit and dessert and like puddings and lots of stuff. And he'd sort of wandered around and he'd seen custard, and he poured like custard on top of his meat and pasta, and we were like, what do we do? So he sat down quite quickly, and I was like, right, I'm going to go over and tell him. I was like, what am I going to tell him? Like, I don't speak, Cantonese. And so I went over and he started eating it, and he was eating the pasta with custard on, and he looked like, and then one of my mates was like, actually, I'm going to try that. So he got pasta and put custard on the pasta, and he was like, this is really nice, actually. So, so we all kind of, like as a bit of a treat, would have a bit of pasta with a bit of, with custard on. And actually, when you think about it, it's a bit like sort of rice pudding. It was really nice. Yeah.
They also trying to catch somebody else. you end up
Yeah.
accidentally trying something new yourselves. Amazing.
Yeah.
The power of international collaboration.
But
Wonderful.
when you're in that environment, it's amazing because you get to meet athletes from all around the world, from every jurisdiction. You get to be friends with athletes from all around the world. Um, it's it is like a big family. It's kind of fascinating how it ends up.
Amazing. Listeners, if you've just tuned in, you're listening to Sunday the Community Show with me, Hafiz Muhammad Umar, here at Inspire 105.1 FM. And today I am ever so delighted to be joined by Baroness Grey-Thompson, who is multi medal winner at various Paralympics around the world, a real disability rights champion, and not just by tongue, but also by heart and example as well, and a real ambassador to the world of disabilities. And Baroness Grey-Thompson has very kindly taken the time to join me today to share her own experiences as well as the excellent work she's currently doing at the Houses of Lords to ensure that the disability rights movement and the work continues and is not forgotten. Tani, you were just telling us about your experiences from some of the most amazing Paralympics around the world. So then from there, from Atlanta, you went to Sydney, or was it Athens
Mm.
next? Sydney.
Sydney and then Athens. Yeah.
Athens. And how did this experience change on each occasion? I guess there might have been more technology coming in as well, because end of the 1990s, early 2000s, the internet had started to emerge. There was mobile phones, or the old brick phones with the
Yeah.
snake or whatever. And so, how did that change your routines at all?
I mean, certainly sort of more technology in terms of, the chair design and the ability to communicate. I mean, for me, when the internet came out, I mean, it was amazing in that you could get you could track what other athletes were doing around the world. So there used to be an American magazine called Sports and Spokes, which was published every month, and it was lots of information and about wheelchair sport, and about what basketball teams were doing, big wheelchair racing around the world. And you had to wait for this to arrive every month. And on the internet, you could suddenly, if you weren't at the LA Marathon, within a day at the time, you could look at the results. Now you get, now I can watch the LA Marathon on my phone, and there's an app to track, different athletes. These days I do some commentary, so I work on the London Marathon. I can put the top wheelchair athletes onto my phone and track where they are on every single bit of the course. So it's amazing how technology has helped and supported that in terms of, as a commentator, also, as an athlete, being able to do things. So it's also kind of funny that I worked on the bid and delivery for the 2012 games, and back in 2010. So we were kind of looking for ways to maybe save some money. I remember somebody saying, do we really need internet in the village? And can you imagine if in 2012, I now, young people just think the internet exists like wherever they go, can you imagine not having the internet in the village? So technology made a big difference to be able to just things like enter. You used to have to enter races by sending a letter, and hoping it would get there in time. And my daughter's 23, and she's like, "What? You used to like send a letter to Atlanta to enter a race?" And went, "Yeah, you did. Yeah." Now it's just an app. So it's kind of interesting how it's changed. So so it didn't really change. So we used to do a lot of sports science stuff. We used to test in the lab, and they'd measure your skin folds, which would measure your body fat, and used to do various tests. And that didn't change that much, but certainly made life easier as an athlete, being able to kind of enter races, and it made traveling a lot easier.
And certainly, as you mentioned, having to use the telephones at the starting of your career to be able to communicate with family, to suddenly, being able to send quick messages, which is completely different, and certainly being able to track people around, it makes it so much easier. And in terms of the actual wheelchairs, do they have any of this, new technology built into them, apps or anything at all, or is that work in progress yet?
Yeah, so a lot of the chairs now have more carbon fiber in. So we'd start to build them some chairs with carbon fiber. Now you've called wearables. We always used to train with heart rate monitors, but you can you can use your GPS tracking. So some of that technology is really interesting, but you still got to train hard. It doesn't give you like a shortcut to training hard and smart. So, I say to a lot of young athletes, you don't need to be buying very expensive watches. My very first coach, at the end of each bit of the training session we do, you can take your pulse at your neck, and so, yeah, it is much easier when you just look at your watch and it tells you what your heart rate is. But, you can also tell by your breathing if you've trained hard, and you can just, do. So I say to the youngsters, don't get pulled into you needing all these expensive products. It's a bit like, there's lots of, protein powders and all these sorts of things. At the end of a really hard training session, a jam sandwich and half a pint of milk, that's really good for you. So, I love technology and the use of it, but you've got to train hard. And then the rest is just sort of icing on the cake.
No. Tani, it's been an absolute pleasure having you with us. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your personal life journey with us from a very young age to where you are now as an excellent role model and ambassador, not just for the professional athletes, but also for every individual with disabilities. Thank you so much for coming on to our show.
Thank you.
Listeners, this is it for today. I had Baroness Tani Grey-Thompson with me here on Inspire 105.1 FM to share her life journey with us for sending the community. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do tune in again next week, and we shall speak to you then. All the best. Bye for now. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.